Okay, I'm going to demonstrate how to sculpt a shoe in wire. So we're going to start with our 16 gauge wire and needle nose pliers. It's important to know the different parts of the pliers and how they work. The narrow point of the pliers will help twist the wire around. The wider part of the jaw will help crimp it. And then you have the cutters on the side. You may also need some tape along the way. First, I'm going to demonstrate a T-joint. So that is when the wire intersects like a cross. And I highly encourage you to practice these types of joints before you start to sculpt your shoe. At this point, I'm using the cutter, the side cutters, and you can see there to squeeze the wire and snip little pieces just for practice. I'm going to start by making a shepherd's hook on one of the pieces, and I'll crimp it a little tighter so it doesn't slip around so much. So I'll pinch it with the narrow part of the jaw, and you can see it slides around. Now I'm going to go back to the wide part of the jaw and start to curl the tail around to create a stronger, tighter connection. And I test it, and it's still sliding around, so now I know I need to crimp it a little bit tighter. And I like to use both of my hands to get a stronger grip. So now I'm going to show you how to do a lap joint. This one you won't use so often. You'll probably just use it one or two times in your whole design. And it's a little bit more difficult. So I create two shepherd's hooks and then wrap the tails around, crimp that connection so it's nice and tight, it's not loose and won't wiggle around. And it takes a little bit of time to wrap those tails around. I suggest at first cutting a really long tail and then trimming some off after the connection is secure and strong. And here I'm using the jaws of the pliers to straighten out that wire on either side of the connection. So there's some finished examples of T-joints and lap joints. So next I'm going to pick up my shoe and I'm going to make some decisions on where to start. So I mentioned that that's a really dominant line that my finger is tracing, and the sole of the shoe where the rubber meets the suede and the fabric is another dominant line. I'm going to decide to start with the sole of the shoe and build a really strong structure and then build up from there. Here I'm straightening the tension out from the wire. You know, the wire comes in a spiral and it's almost like a slinky. So I pinch the wire and then stretch it through my hands to create a straighter wire to begin. Now I'm going to use the actual shoe. Remember, we're sculpting on a 1-to-1 scale. That means we want to sculpt the actual sides of the shoe. And I'm going to start to wrap it around the sole, pressing with my thumb as I go along. And one thing that I had to decide is where to start that, because I know that when I connect it with a lap joint, that's going to be a visual focal point. So I don't want to start that in a random area. I want to start it where there would be a seam or a line meeting it anyway. So initially I'm going to use Scotch tape to try to hold the lines down, but I'll discover later that that Scotch tape just doesn't hold enough, so I'll switch to a duct tape. But this all depends on the type of shoe that you choose. You may decide that you want to just eyeball it and not use your shoe as a guide at all, and use instead measurements. It just depends on how your brain thinks and works. I like to use the shoe as a guide because I'm a right brainer, not a left brainer. Keep in mind also that I've distilled this 5-hour demonstration into 30 minutes. So many parts of this demonstration are fast forwarded 4 times. Next, I'm going to make sure that I have plenty of overlap where I cut it, because these are eventually going to have to be shepherd's hooks, and then the tails are going to be wrapped around. So you can see that I have about 1 inch of overlap on either side of that intersection there. So I'm going to hold it firmly in place and make nice shepherd's hooks. So my thumb is kind of marking the point where those two will connect so that my measurements don't get thrown off. So now I'll hook the 2 shepherd's hooks together. I'm going to use the front half of the jaw just to get those crimped initially. Then I'll use the back part of the jaw to get that nice and tight with both hands squeezing. Then I'll use the tip of the jaw to wrap those tails around. Again, I want to make sure that it's a really tight connection that doesn't slip around. So I'm going to place it back on the shoe and make sure that that line is nice and accurate. I kind of check for accuracy at little points along the way. I don't want to keep adding wires to inaccurate lines. Otherwise, I'll have to start all over again. So I'll tape it in place to make sure that it doesn't move around. Kind of like a third hand for myself. And just be aware that your thumbs will get very sore. You might have peeling skin. My thumbs are really calloused, so I can do a lot of pressing without much pain, but you may want to consider wrapping your thumbs during this project with medical tape while you work. And here I'm refining that connection, clipping off any tails, and making sure that it's nice and strong and isn't too much of a focal point. Just going to tape this down to make sure that it doesn't move around while I work on the sole. Next, I'm going to start to make creative decisions about how to define the form of the sole. So this rubber sole wraps around, like vertically around the edge of the shoe, and the toe portion of the shoe is distinguished from the arch and the heel. So I'm going to create a curved line, and that will help distinguish the arch from the toe of the shoe. So I'm pressing it along the edge so I can define that curved rubber portion. I'm bending the wire so I know where those T-joins need to be. And again, I'm making that connection in a place that makes sense visually. So I don't want to connect it just in a random place. I want to connect it in a place where it won't be disruptive for the viewer. Now I'm going to start to look at the heel. You know, in my initial idea sketches, I wanted to create a signature down here, but I've decided that that might not be the best idea. So I think I might try a curved line to distinguish how the weight rests on that heel, and it also celebrates the pattern that's already there in the sole of the shoe. Again, it's not a big deal if your final design deviates from your sketch. Your sketch is just like a rough draft or an initial plan. So here I've created, I have a wire that's much longer than I know I'll need, so I can always trim off. And now I'm going to use an ink pen to actually draw on the shoe to give me a guideline. This is where you can really celebrate your creativity by deciding what lines would be best to accentuate and highlight the surface and even function of the shoe. And what these lines are doing also is they're giving me a structure that I can build, so I can build vertically. If I were to try to build vertically off of a single line, it wouldn't work. Everything would get distorted and warped. If you are building on your shoe, just make sure that you can pull off that wire sculpture without having to cut it apart. So I am fully aware that I can't wrap lines over top of the toe of the shoe, or I will not be able to get it off without wrecking what I've already created. And you'll see later how I remove it from the shoe and then reform it a little bit. So I'm just refining these lines with the tip of the plier jaw, making sure that they're accurate before I move on. Sometimes I like to work production style. If I know that I have 3 lines to attach, I'll go ahead and cut 3 pieces, straighten them out. So here I'm using the jaws of the pliers to straighten out that wire. And one thing that is really recognizable in the Keen brand of shoes is this rounded rubberized toe. Almost every pair of Keen shoes has a rounded rubberized toe. So that is what I want to be the focal point of this design. So I know that I need to crimp that tail around and twist that tail around before I add the other one, or it'll be really difficult to add subsequent wires. So as I'm making this piece, some creative decisions that I'm thinking about are line density, line pattern, and repetition. So now I'm going to take it off the shoe because I know once I wrap these lines around, I wouldn't be able to get it off the shoe. So before I make this next connection, I need to remove the shoe. Make sure all of my lines are accurate before I move on. And again, that line on the toe where the rubber meets the suede is so important. That's going to be a focal point. So I want to make sure that that's very accurate. So I'm using the narrow part of the jaw of the pliers to refine that line even more. Next, I'm going to look at the profile of that rubber toe. Is it rounded? Is it square? Is it pointy? So I need to get a profile view, which is why I turned my shoe on its side. And it's rounded, but it's kind of a rounded square toe, not completely rounded. So I'm really examining the profile, the specific profile of that shoe and the toe before I make that connection and trim any wire off. I should also note that I made many mistakes along the way in this video, and I have edited them out for your viewing pleasure. So please be patient with yourself as you sculpt and wire, and know that it's going to take at least 10 to 12 hours to sculpt your shoe. You might put in 2 hours and have to destroy all of that work because it's just not working out. my rule of thumb is if it's not working out and you can't get over a hurdle when you're sculpting, it's easier to start over than to try to make something work. Just consider it really great practice. So while I've been making these connections, I can feel that the sole has distorted a little bit. So every so often I take a break to check my lines and make sure that the sole is sitting flat on the tabletop and that the form and proportions have not distorted before I make that connection. And you'll see later that I'll kind of move on after I attach these 3 wires to the toe, because initially I think, oh, well, 3 wires will define that rounded toe. But after I start to continue to build the sculpture, I'll revisit that portion and realize that many more wires are needed to define that very important part of the shoe. So here again, I'm using the narrow part of the jaw of the pliers to refine that line. It was starting to get a little too bumpy. Use my hands, pinch the wire, pull it through the pinch to get a straighter wire. And now I'm going to focus on creating the heel of the sole. Again, it's a rounded rubberized sole. So these lines are going to connect from the tip of the heel down to the arch. And I'm working kind of production style here. I'm cutting three pieces of wire and straightening them out. And here I'm trying to figure out where do I want these wires to attach. I'm going to go ahead and make shepherd's hooks on all 3 of them. And I'm constantly rotating the piece to get a better grip to create strong connections. So I can manipulate the wire much easier if this sole is upside down than if it's right side up. And again, I'm using only the 16 gauge wire that was provided in your toolkit. However, if you feel the need to use thicker or thinner wire, you are welcome to go to Lowe's or a home improvement store, even a craft store like Hobby Lobby or Michael's, to buy thicker or thinner wire. A thicker wire will create a more dominant line in your design and more structure, but will be more difficult to manipulate. A thinner wire will be easier to manipulate and may be good for fine details. You also may consider purchasing additional tools. There are dolphin nose pliers, side cutters, end cutters that may make the process a little bit easier for you. It's all about how much money you want to invest in this project. But again, the tools that are provided will be fine to complete and succeed. It's just how, I really love buying tools, so of course I have all of the different crimping tools and jewelry making tools available. But the tools, again, the tools that are provided will suffice. So it's not until I realize where these wires will be connected that I trim them. It's much easier to manipulate a really long wire and form it to exactly where it's going to be connected and trim some off later than to try to make a really short wire work. One of the principles for 3D design, for successful 3D design, is that a structural decision should be a visual decision. So as I'm making decisions on where these wires connect, I'm thinking about creating a really strong structure to build upon. I'm also thinking that these lines are going to lead the viewer's eye throughout the composition. If they connect in a place that is disruptive, then my design will be flawed. So, something to consider wherever you connect. Yes, it's part of the structure and it's part of how you build the piece, but it also needs to make sense with the design and not connect in a place that doesn't make sense. So here I have a pretty strong structure for the sole. These lines are supporting one another and are strong enough to support vertical lines. So I'm going to focus next on this really dominant line in the vertical part of the shoe. So I'm using a really long piece of wire here, much longer than I know I'll need. I'm going to go ahead and overlap the sole because I know that's where it will connect and create my shepherd's hook, extra long shepherd's hook. And now I'm going to just press it with my thumb along the way, make sure that I have an accurate line. I'll use duct tape to secure it in place so it doesn't wiggle around. And this is a really organic line. So yes, I'm worried about accuracy, but it doesn't need to be as accurate as, say, a patent leather high heel, where it's a really stiff line. This is a piece of fabric that's flexible. So again, I cut it a little bit over the sole and create that shepherd's hook. Now I'm removing the tape so I can retrieve that wire and attach it to the sole. And again, I'm thinking about where that attachment's going to happen. I mentioned when I was brainstorming that in order to create a more dominant line, I may want to create a spiral, a tight spiral, and thread the wire through the spiral. And now that I'm seeing it and visualizing it, I'm realizing that that would be really disruptive and not the best decision. So I'm going to stick with just a single wire for this piece. And the wire is thick enough that it will be strong enough to support all of the details that I need to add. I could have also made a decision to twist the wire together to create a more dominant line. But I'm feeling good about the minimal lines that I've chosen so far, and I'm going to keep it kind of cohesive and take a minimal approach to my line density as well. Now I know that this line that I'm creating, this vertical line, is not going to be stable and strong until I attach more verticals. So it looks kind of funky at first, but I am going to attach a vertical at the back or the heel of the shoe, and now I'm bringing the shoe back out and using it as a guide for height. Again, I'm a right brainer, so I like to just kind of use my shoe as a guide, but if you're more of a mathematical or analytical mind, you may want to get out a ruler or calipers to measure. My approach is not the only approach. And at this point, I'm going to make a decision to render that suede tab that's at the back of the shoe. I guess this helps the user or the wearer pull the shoe onto their foot. I just realized that I could render that with a continuous line. So you can see how one of those vertical lines is nice and long. So I'm going to make a continuous line here, almost like 3 sides of a square, and then it comes back up again to render that tab. So it's a continuous line that leads the viewer's eye around. It's also the idea of economy. So I'm distilling that little feature on the shoe that's really not that important into the bare minimum. So I've left myself a little bit of a tail there so I can do a T-joint there. And that's a very organic part of the shoe. It's floppy, it doesn't have very much structure. So I'm not too worried about accuracy for the dimensions. So I keep checking myself along the way to make sure that the scale is accurate. Remember, we're sculpting on a 1-to-1 scale, so it needs to be the exact same size as the original shoe. And the proportions are accurate. Proportions are comparison of part to part of a single object. So I keep checking myself along the way to make sure that I'm paying close attention to accuracy. Now I realize that when it comes time to sculpt the eyelets that the shoelaces are threaded through, I can make use of that spiral that I didn't use. So I'm going to use the spiral to create little teardrop shapes that are meant to render the eyelets, create a little tail on them. I'm looking at placement, making sure that the placement of that little eyelet is accurate. And I like the idea of these floating in space. So I'm going to continue with that. Cut off little pieces of the spiral, make a teardrop, leave a tail, and create a really strong crimp on that single line to make it look as though those eyelets are floating in space. Another technique would be that depending on the size of your eyelet, you could wrap it around a pencil. You may even be able to wrap it around the end of the needle nose pliers and then round it out later. I've also seen some students use found objects to render eyelets in shoes, like pop tabs or beads or washers. I would just be sure that whatever you choose, if it is a found object, is not too disruptive and too dissimilar to the wire that it creates too much focus on that part of the sculpture. Again, one thing you might think about, and I mentioned this in a previous lecture, is spray painting your final piece. So you'll see that I leave my piece as the original silver patina, but what would this piece look like if I spray painted it black? What would it look like if I spray painted it banana yellow? Maybe the color relates to the type of shoe. If it were a cowboy boot, maybe I would choose to spray paint it brown. If it were a rubber rain boot, maybe banana yellow would be a more appropriate color choice. So color can have a great influence on how the viewer perceives your art piece. So again, it's not a requirement for this project, but you may consider spray painting your final sculpture to add further impact. So between that last portion of the demo and these still images, I added many more lines to the toe to reinforce that rounded portion. I also added the tongue and my initials on the top of the tongue. That was where the Keen label was. And I added kind of a V shape to show where the quilted portion differed from the suede portion near the heel. So you can see that I use minimal lines and the idea of economy. Best wishes as you start your wire project.